In 1980, a real stir went through New Zealand bloodstock circles when a top stallion called Charivari was spirited away from a Waikato stud farm. The horse was the subject of an ownership dispute. The man who took Charivari hid the horse in various locations round Auckland for almost a month before the court intervened. That man was Patrick Sean Wilson, and it was not to be the last time he'd be the talk of the bloodstock industry. 6 years later, Pat Wilson's face appeared with the faces of 4 other people in a glossy brochure. He'd been made a director of Australasian breeding stables, later to be known as the Strathmore Group. Wilson's job would be almost total control over $30 million worth of stud farms and horses in Australia, New Zealand and the United States. As evidence of his horse trading expertise, Pat Wilson wrote a letter to a future fellow director of Strathmore, claiming that in the year up to his appointment, he'd had $3.5 million worth of personal earnings from bloodstock. Looking at the various reports, it's clear that it was on the strength of such claims by Pat Wilson that the board of ABS, later Strathmore, agreed to pay him $3 million in cash when he became a Strathmore director last October. The money was paid for Pat Wilson's own company called Wairaki Bloodstock. It was on the basis that that company had had after-tax profits of $1.5 million in the previous 12 months. So what the board was doing was paying $3 million for Pat Wilson's professed ability to make substantial profits from his expertise in bloodstock. It was to be characteristic of several deals done around the Strathmore board table, whereby directors, apart from Sir Russell Pettigrew, sold their own companies into the whole group. Companies, some of which ended up being a major drain on the resources of the overall organisation, making millions of dollars in losses and bringing the company to the verge of collapse. This is Waikato Stud near Matamata. This time of the year, it's an utterly charming place. Last year, its fine facilities and breeding record caught the attention of Strathmore, and they bought a 51% controlling interest in the publicly owned stud. Down this way, the locals, many of them small shareholders in the part of Waikato Stud that Strathmore didn't own, were interested to see what sort of changes the new boss, Pat Wilson, would make. In the event, there's been an uproar. Stud manager Steve Brem resigned only a few months after Strathmore took over, saying the board was ignoring his repeated warnings about what was going on. Among the concerns of stud staff, Pat Wilson had arranged a breeding program that heavily favoured stallions which he'd personally syndicated or in which he had shares. For the privilege, Waikato Stud was charged the top dollar in service fees. Under the management of Strathmore, the stud's top stallion, Zephyr Bay, was mysteriously transferred from the property, was flown out of New Zealand in what some said was a veil of secrecy, and ended up at Balfour Stud, Strathmore's Australian horse breeding base. Waikato Stud was also hit with a huge bill for another horse called Twigmoss, a top stallion who also stands at Balfour in New South Wales. Strathmore paid more than $5 million for 2/3 of the shares in Twigmoss, intending to resell most of the shares by mid-1987. The plans for on-selling the shares failed to eventuate, and Waikato Stud finished the year, at least on provisional figures, far worse off than the previous year, with a loss of more than $3 million. Interest payments on Twigmoss, who wasn't even at Waikato, accounted for much of the red ink.
Last time goes for 425. Thank you.
So a lot has changed since Strathmore directors went bargain hunting at the horse sales earlier this year.
Let's go. 425.
Pat Wilson, the man on the right, now stands accused by fellow directors of having run fine bloodstock assets, including Waikato Stud, in such a way that hopes of a multi-million-dollar profit for Strathmore evaporated.
Well done. Let's go.
The most bitter cries of protest are now coming from the small shareholders in Waikato Stud, who expressed disgust at the way Strathmore managed their company.
We just want it brought out in the open, just what kind of people have been running that company into the ground.
Steve Lindsay is a Morrinsville accountant who's been plaguing Strathmore with questions about Waikato Stud. 2 weeks ago, he and other Waikato Stud shareholders confronted the man who's just bought the property off Strathmore. He's Australian businessman Gary Needham, and he's arranged for an accounting firm to go through Strathmore's management of Waikato Stud with a fine-tooth comb.
We want this investigation to be absolutely thorough, and if it is that certain individuals owe this company money, we want to make absolutely sure we get it.
Gary Needham has good reason for being curious about the past goings-on. Needham has bought virtually everything Strathmore's been forced to sell of its international portfolio of bloodstock interests, including Waikato stud. Back in June, there was a lot of midnight oil being burned up at the Strathmore offices as what was left of a shattered company tried to write deals for the sale of assets. On the night of June 10th, off the fax machine, came an amazing letter from Gary Needham's Sydney-based lawyers. It alleged Needham had inspected a schedule of Strathmore horses offered for sale. The letter noted, some of the bloodstock you're offering has never existed, is not at present owned by you, or was, to your knowledge, dead at the time of the execution of the agreement. The schedule of horses in question had been drawn up by Strathmore director Pat Wilson. In Sydney, I spoke to Gary Needham's lawyer, Tim McHenry, about the allegations of dead and non-existent horses on the schedule.
I guess, you know, people would have cause to be quite rightly concerned that that those things could happen, and our view is...
That's a bit of an understatement, isn't it?
Well, you know, it depends upon your view. Each of those standing alone, those pieces of misinformation by category, may not have individually been sufficiently serious to warrant the action we took, but collectively they did represent, in our view, a substantial deviation from the agreement that we'd struck.
And so back in Auckland there were more late nights, this time for a troubleshooter brought in by Omnicorp, the company that's come to Strathmore's aid. This time they drew up a deal that Needham liked. All the horses in the new agreement were alive. But the issues which relate to Strathmore's bloodstock interests and how they've been bought and sold go even further. In these pictures we have disguised the identity of one man. He's an Australian businessman whom we taped meeting with colleagues in Auckland 3 weeks ago. Originally the man was interviewed undisguised for this program, but in the last 48 hours he's asked that we protect his identity. He says he was involved in a deal for the selling of horse breeding interests in Australia into the Strathmore Group.
We interviewed the Australian businessman here in this block of Auckland townhouses. We've received an urgent fax message from him now asking that we not include any portion of the interview that we did with him in our program. He says he's very worried about the legal implications for himself if we do show any of the interview, and he also claims he is worried about his personal safety. What we can tell you is that from other sources we understand the deal about which he's most concerned is the selling into the Strathmore Group of Balfour Stud in New South Wales. Now that deal cost Strathmore $2.5 million Australian dollars, and we know from documents we've seen that a 400,000 Australian dollar commission was paid when Balfour was bought. We know that it's that commission that the Australian businessman is concerned about. We also know from documents we've seen that the $400,000 commission was paid to Patrick Sean Wilson.
Pat Wilson refuses to be interviewed by Eyewitness about the Strathmore affair, but through his lawyer has pointed out he was quite entitled to that commission because it was paid before he became a Strathmore director. That appears correct and clear, but unclear is the issue of who else may be entitled to a share of that commission. For the time being, we can say no more. At the Strathmore shareholders meeting in July, it was announced that lawyers were combing the records of Strathmore for ways of getting money from people who might be held liable for funds lost to the company. In downtown Auckland, the legal audit is still grinding on, occupying the attentions of at least 2 lawyers virtually full-time in the portals of Chapman Tripp Sheffield Young. Eyewitness understands that when Omnicorp and the remnants of the Strathmore board confronted Pat Wilson with some demands for reconciliation in mid-1987, Pat Wilson did attempt to put some things right. For example, there were some mares belonging to Wilson which had been served by the company stallion Twig Moss in Australia without the board's knowledge. Wilson did a deal of sorts to try and straighten that one out. But what's still far from straightened out is some horse business in the United States. A deal was struck in Lexington, Kentucky for Strathmore by a Queensland horse trader called Neville Stewart, who's also a big shareholder in Strathmore. It involved Strathmore getting a horse called Pleach. A key fact is that Stewart secured for Strathmore, as part of the Pleach deal, 10 free services for Strathmore mares by an American stallion. Total value of that package, 100,000 American dollars. As well as that, $25,000 worth of boarding for Strathmore mares in Kentucky. It was a good deal, and Pat Wilson would have been expected to tell his fellow directors about it. But in the event, Strathmore directors like Angus Fraser were not told, at least not until Fraser had gone to Kentucky and had got chatting with the agent Neville Stewart. By that time, we understand Pat Wilson had already used a number of the American stallion services and a large amount of the $25,000 worth of stabling for his own personal broodmares. Wilson, now no longer a director of Strathmore, says he'll pay any outstanding bills to the company, but he insists Strathmore still owes him a lot of money anyway for bloodstock deals he did on their behalf. The final saga revolves around two of the world's most expensive stallions, Dahar and Palace Music. The stallions arrived here from the United States 3 weeks ago for a limited breeding season. Strathmore now knows Pat Wilson had 2 mares which he says are his, served by these stallions in America using serving rights which belong to Strathmore. Strathmore are awaiting with great interest the arrival of the bill for 45,000 American dollars. Pat Wilson, filmed here at a horse sale earlier this year, has told us he won't involve himself in media discussion. But in writing back to us, he said the bloodstock decisions for Strathmore were made by both Angus Fraser and himself. Not so, says Angus Fraser. Pat Wilson exercised total control over the bloodstock division of the company. At the end of the day, Strathmore failed to make its healthy bloodstock interests work, not because the assets were no good, but because vital discussions never took place around the Strathmore board table. After the break, the clean-up in the Strathmore stables. In the final part of our story, we ask why someone didn't figure out much earlier what was really going on in this amazing company. In June 1987, there was a radical reshuffle at the headquarters of the Strathmore Group in Auckland. A 30-year-old whiz kid called Ian Roberts was brought in by Omnicorp, major shareholders in Strathmore, to try to straighten out some of the muddle. Roberts had to figure out what had gone wrong, reassure the shareholders, and try to stave off potential receivership moves. To recap, Omnicorp had paid nearly $14 million for a 20% stake in Strathmore. The share market dive and the loss of confidence in Strathmore had wiped about $10 million off the value of Omnicorp's investment. So why had Omnicorp been caught with such an apparent lemon in its portfolio? Especially since last December they got their own man, Dr. Ray Thompson, a top financial analyst, onto the board of Strathmore, supposedly into a driving seat position. New boss at Strathmore, Ian Roberts, says it wasn't quite that simple.
The seeds of the problem were sown before Ray Thompson was appointed to the board. When at Ray Thompson's first board meeting, all the deals were in place. He acted very decisively in the light of those problems. For example, within a month of his appointment as a director, he was instrumental in the removal of Clive Curry as chairman. When the issue blew up in June, within 48 hours, he had a proposal on the table to rescue Strathmore. As you suggest, Ray Thompson is undoubtedly one of the leading analysts in New Zealand. And the difficulties he had getting to the bottom of the Strathmore issue, I think perhaps reflects the complex nature of the business.
The wider business world was keen to know what had really gone on around the Strathmore board table during the crucial months. Sir Russell Pettigrew, who'd actually been on the board, was one we turned to